It was a time when the very soul of Israel seemed to be slipping into an encroaching darkness, a shadow that had fallen since the passing of King Solomon. God's chosen people, once so vibrant in their devotion, had slowly, almost imperceptibly, begun to drift away, their memory of the Almighty fading like an old photograph. Under the iron fist of King Ahab, a ruler so notoriously wicked that his name would forever be synonymous with corruption, the decline accelerated. The sacred land of Israel was now stained with the innocent blood of prophets, hunted down and mercilessly eliminated by Jezebel, Ahab's cruel and cunning queen. The very name of God, Yahweh, had all but vanished from their lips, replaced by whispered vows and bowed knees before crude altars of stone and wood dedicated to pagan idols. Yet, amidst this spiritual famine, God had not abandoned his people. Deep within the rugged, ancient hills of Gilead, a desolate, forgotten land, a divine answer was being meticulously prepared. From that barren wilderness emerged a man whose very presence would ignite a revolution, a man destined to alter the course of history forever. Elijah. His name itself resonated with a powerful dual promise of divine judgment and consuming fire. My God is Yahweh, his name declared, a defiant truth echoing against the backdrop of idol worship. This, then, is the saga of the mightiest prophet, a man who dared to command the very skies to seal themselves shut, who summoned fire from the heavens themselves, and who miraculously never tasted death. But it is also a profoundly human story, peeling back the layers to reveal the man behind the prophetic mantle, his deep-seated fears, his gnawing doubts, and the profound loneliness that consumed him from within until it threatened to break him entirely. For Elijah, despite his extraordinary calling, was undeniably human, and his most formidable battle was not waged against formidable kings or vast armies, but against the insidious whispers of his own insecurities and the crushing weight of isolation that often accompanies a solitary walk with God. For many years, Elijah had dwelt in an almost sacred silence, a hermit's existence, hidden deep among the ancient wind-swept mountains. He was neither a celebrated warrior nor an esteemed priest. His appearance was as raw and untamed as the wilderness that nurtured him. He wore coarse garments woven from camel hair, a thick, untrimmed beard obscured his face, and in his eyes burned an otherworldly fire, a reflection of the divine spark within him. But then, one pivotal day, God unveiled to him his profound calling. The long, silent vigil was finally over. Elijah rose, a man transformed by divine purpose, descended from the desolate mountains, and strode directly into the very heart of corruption. Samaria, the opulent capital city where King Ahab ruled with Queen Jezebel, their throne built upon idolatry and injustice. As he approached the imposing palace gates, the seasoned soldiers stationed there froze in their tracks, their bodies paralyzed by an unseen power, a chilling stillness that gripped them. They stood transfixed, utterly unable to move, allowing him to pass as if the very air itself yielded a path for him. Elijah walked through the labyrinthian corridors of the throne room, unannounced and unescorted, his silent advance causing servants to retreat with each purposeful stride. The grand columns of the palace, which had witnessed kings and ambassadors bowing in deference, now seemed to bear witness to something entirely different, a wild, untamed prophet, devoid of crown or sword, yet striding forward with an unshakable resolve, as if propelled by the hand of God himself. And there, upon his ornate throne, surrounded by sycophantic counselors, glittering idols, and the suffocating vanity of his court, sat King Ahab. Yet before he could even utter a single word to question the identity of this audacious stranger, Elijah stood boldly before him, his voice echoing with the undeniable authority of heaven. He uttered words that would indelibly seal the kingdom's fate, a decree as certain as the rising sun. As surely as the Lord lives, the God of Israel whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain during these years, except at my word. A heavy silence, thick with the weight of impending judgment, descended upon the throne room. No one dared to draw a breath, the air itself seeming to grow taut with anticipation. Elijah, his message delivered, did not linger for a response. He turned abruptly, his figure dissolving into the shadows from whence he came, disappearing as swiftly as he had appeared. Ahab, for his part, remained unmoving, not uttering a single word. He did not order Elijah seized, nor did he curse him. He simply sat there, motionless, his mind grappling with the prophet's audacious declaration. And then it began. Suddenly, almost imperceptibly at first, the clouds began to dissipate, their fluffy forms vanishing into the vast expanse of the sky. The air, once humid, turned dry and brittle, and the sky above began to close up, tightening like a massive door sealed shut from on high. It was a tangible shift, a palpable change in the very atmosphere, a silent, unfolding testament to Elijah's pronouncement. As Elijah departed the king's presence, God spoke to him once more, his voice a comforting presence amidst the burgeoning desolation. "Leave this place. Go eastward and hide yourself by the brook Cherith, east of the Jordan. You will drink from the brook, and I have commanded ravens to feed you there." Elijah, a man of wavering faith, obeyed without the slightest hesitation. He turned eastward, his footsteps tracing a path towards the wilderness, leaving a trail of parched earth in his wake. The cool, gentle breeze that once kissed the land ceased its whispered caress, and the life-giving dew which had faithfully moistened the fields of Israel each morning fell no more. The merciless sun scorched the once fertile fields, and what had once been a proud and bountiful nation began to wither, its vibrancy draining away with each passing day. The judgment had already commenced, a slow, agonizing descent into drought, and for 3 long, desolate years, not a single drop of rain would grace the parched earth.
As the vast kingdom of Israel plunged deeper into the suffocating grip of drought, Elijah, guided by an unseen hand, traversed across a landscape of parched hills and desolate valleys. His journey was a testament to his unwavering faith, a solitary pilgrimage through a land that was slowly dying. Finally, after days of relentless travel, he discovered the hidden sanctuary, the secret place God had designated for him, the brook Cherith. It lay cunningly concealed between the dry, unforgiving hills near the mighty Jordan River, a thin, glistening ribbon of water slicing through the cracked earth like a delicate scar, snaking its way among parched rocks and dusty, brittle bushes. It was an oasis, fragile yet miraculous, nestled deep within the vast, desolate embrace of the desert. Here, in this secluded refuge, Elijah settled, his existence a quiet testament to divine provision. With every sunrise and every sunset, a profound miracle unfolded before his very eyes. At dawn, as the first golden rays of the sun began to stir in the east, a sudden, rhythmic fluttering of wings would break the profound silence of the sky. Ravens, those black-feathered birds often considered ominous and unclean by human law, would appear along the horizon. They arrived not as scavengers, but as messengers of mercy, carrying freshly baked bread and tender meat clamped firmly in their beaks. They would gracefully settle near the prophet, gently place the sustenance before him, and then, with a final beat of their powerful wings, vanish once more into the boundless sky. These were creatures despised by men, yet they were the very ones chosen by God to deliver nourishment, faithfully, morning and evening alike. As the hills were painted in amber hues by the sun's fading light, Elijah would eat in profound solitude, his meals consumed in an almost reverent silence. He drank deeply from the cool, life-giving waters of the brook, observing the relentless march of time as days melted into weeks and weeks stretched into long, agonizing months. And all the while, this drought, like a silent, insidious curse, spread its dark, suffocating shadow over every corner of Israel. The wells, once brimming with life, ran utterly dry. The fertile fields, once verdant and abundant, became barren, cracked landscapes of dust and despair. Animals, their bodies withered and gaunt, collapsed, exhausted, onto the parched, cracked earth, their last breaths exhaled into the suffocating, dusty air. From his opulent, yet increasingly desperate throne, King Ahab screamed orders, his voice raw with frustration and a desperate urgency. He demanded to find the man responsible for his kingdom's ruin, the elusive prophet who had vanished as mysteriously as he appeared. Yet no news ever came. Elijah, secured by divine command, remained hidden by the increasingly dwindling waters of the brook. But gradually, even in his secluded sanctuary, he began to notice a subtle, disquieting change. The stones that had once been submerged beneath the surface of the brook now emerged, stark and dry, like desolate islands along the ever-shrinking riverbed. The once powerful current, a rushing torrent, had dwindled to a thin, struggling trickle. The very drought he himself had prophesied was finally, inevitably, reaching him. Until one bleak morning, when he bent down to drink, he found no water at all, only the lingering dampness between the unresponsive stones. The brook Cherith had dried up completely. But Elijah, a man seasoned by unwavering faith, neither panicked nor uttered a single complaint. He simply held fast to his profound trust in God and waited. Until at last, the unmistakable voice of God spoke clearly, resonating within his spirit. "Arise, go to Zarephath in Sidon and stay there. I've commanded a widow there to care for you." The Lord was sending him into dangerous territory, to Zarephath, the very homeland of Jezebel, the queen who had sworn to wipe out all of God's prophets. Yet Elijah did not hesitate. He stood, wrapped his cloak tightly around him, and began walking. The journey was grueling, a relentless test of endurance. The sun, a merciless orb in the bleached sky, beat down relentlessly on cracked fields and lifeless trees, their skeletal branches reaching like grasping hands towards an indifferent heaven. The drought spared nothing, its cruel embrace suffocating every living thing, forcing them to bow beneath the very judgment he himself had proclaimed. The land was a vast, silent testament to the divine pronouncement. When Elijah finally reached the gates of Zarephath, a city weary and strained by the prolonged famine, he saw her. A frail woman, her frame thin and her garments tattered, was stooping to pick up dry sticks, her movements slow and deliberate. Her face, etched with weariness, bore the marks of hardship, her hands cracked and calloused from relentless toil, and her eyes, though still holding a flicker of resilience, were clouded with a deep-seated defeat. Something profound within his spirit confirmed it. This was the widow God had spoken of. Elijah approached her, his voice calm, a stark contrast to the harshness of the sun and desert wind that had weathered his face. "Please, bring me a bit of water in a jar so I may drink." The woman, her face a mask of obedience, turned to comply, her movements slow and resigned. But before she could take another step, Elijah continued, his voice imbued with a quiet urgency, "And please bring me a piece of bread in your hand." She stopped, her shoulders slumping. Her eyes, filled with a profound despair, lowered to the dusty ground. With a voice trembling with the weight of her suffering, she replied, "As surely as the Lord your God lives, I have no bread. All I have is a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil left in a pitcher. I was gathering a few sticks to prepare one last meal for myself and my son. After that, we'll die." And there, in that still, hushed moment, another truth, far deeper than the physical drought itself, was starkly revealed. The crisis was not merely in the skies. It had reached deep into human hearts, robbing them of their very last vestiges of hope. Elijah responded gently, his tone imbued with divine compassion. "Do not be afraid. Go home and do as you have said, but first bake a small cake of bread for me and bring it here, and then afterwards bake something for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says, the jar of flour will not be used up, nor will the pitcher of oil run dry until the day the Lord sends rain upon the earth." The woman stared at him in profound silence, her mind reeling. She faced a stark, agonizing choice: cling desperately to the meager, fleeting hope of the little she had left, or let it go all and fully trust the word of the stranger. She could die with a semblance of dignity, or she could obey and witness what might happen. In a moment of quiet, desperate faith, she chose to believe, not in Baal, nor the empty idols of her people, nor even her own instincts. She chose to believe the word of a stranger, a dusty wanderer whose eyes seemed to have witnessed more than any mortal man could bear. She returned home, her steps imbued with a newfound, fragile resolve. She lit the fire, poured the flour, mixed in the oil, and baked the small cake. And when she came back to the jar, the flour was still there, replenished as if by an unseen hand, and the oil never ran dry. That day all three of them ate, she, her son, and Elijah, a miraculous meal in the midst of famine, and again the next day, and the next, and on for many days, the simple provisions never failing.
Yet the fragile peace of their miraculously sustained existence was abruptly shattered. The widow's son, once again vibrant, suddenly fell ill. At first, it was merely a fever, a common ailment, but with each passing hour, his breaths grew shallower, more labored, until, within a few terrifying hours, the child stopped breathing altogether. The mother, her heart ripped open, sank to her knees, utterly broken from the inside out. A raw, guttural cry of anguish escaped her lips. The same man who had brought life into her household now seemed to have brought death. A tormenting thought echoed in her mind. "Have you come to remind me of my sins?" she cried out to him, her face bathed in hot tears. "Have you come just to kill my son?" Her voice, thick with accusation and despair, cut through the quiet air of their shared dwelling. Elijah, his face a mask of sorrow, gave no immediate response. He gently took the boy into his arms, his touch surprisingly tender. He carried the limp form to the upstairs room where he had stayed, laid him carefully upon the bed, and then, his own heart heavy with anguish, he cried out to heaven, his voice a desperate plea. "O Lord my God, have you brought calamity even upon this widow who welcomed me into her home by taking away her son?" Then he did something unprecedented, a desperate act of faith that no prophet before him had ever attempted. Elijah stretched himself out 3 times over the boy, pressing his body against the child's, as if hoping to pour his very own life, his very essence, into the child's lifeless form. He pleaded desperately, his words a passionate, urgent prayer. "O Lord, my God, let this child's life return to him." A long, heavy silence followed, almost unbearable in its oppressive weight. Every breath seemed to hold suspended, until finally, miraculously, the boy's chest rose, a faint, almost imperceptible movement. His lips parted, and a soft, shallow breath returned to his body. Life, against all odds, had been restored. Elijah, his heart overflowing with gratitude, carefully carried the living boy down the stairs, presenting him to his mother. "See," he said, his voice trembling with emotion, "your son is alive." At that very instant, the widow regained more than just her son. She regained her profound faith. With tears streaming down her face, tears of joy and renewed conviction, she declared, "Now I truly know that you are a man of God, and the words of the Lord from your lips are true." In a pagan land, a land where altars burned for false gods carved from lifeless stone and flame, a spark of true faith had now been ignited, a beacon of hope against the encroaching darkness. But still, the devastating drought had not ended. For 3 whole agonizing years, not a single drop of rain fell, and God's judgment, a slow, relentless torment, stretched across Israel like an open, festering wound. Livestock, once plentiful, vanished, their boons bleaching under the merciless sun. Wells dried up, leaving gaping, thirsty mouths in the parched earth, and abundant harvests became only a bitter memory, replaced by the gnawing pangs of hunger. First, hunger struck the poor, its cruel hand seizing the most vulnerable, but soon even the wealthy felt its biting sting, their stores dwindling, their arrogance giving way to a desperate fear.
Yet in all that despair, not everyone bowed down to Baal. Amidst the widespread apostasy, a steadfast few clung to the true God. Among those courageous souls was Obadiah, King Ahab's steward. Obadiah had witnessed the king's casual cruelty, his rampant idolatry, but he stubbornly refused to stand by quietly. Amidst Ahab's relentless persecution and systematic slaughter of the Lord's priests and prophets, Obadiah did the unthinkable, a risky act of profound loyalty and faith. He courageously hid 100 prophets of God in 2 separate caves, 50 in each, and secretly fed them bread and water every single day. He risked his very life, motivated by an unwavering love for his God. Remarkably, he even managed to keep his heroic acts hidden from King Ahab, maintaining the king's trust, a dangerous double life lived on a knife's edge. One bleak morning, the king, desperate and frustrated, gave Obadiah a direct order. Travel through the land, search for grass, for springs, for any stream not yet dried up. Perhaps we can save our horses and mules. Maybe something is still alive. Obadiah, his heart heavy, went out into the ruined kingdom, traversing barren and lifeless fields, the dust swirling around his ankles like restless ghosts. When suddenly in the distance he saw him, There, amidst the dusty, desolate roads, stood Elijah, tall, unmoving, his eyes burning with an ancient fire, of fierce determination. Obadiah, overwhelmed with a mix of awe and terror, fell to the ground, crying out, "Is that you, my lord Elijah?" "It is I," the prophet replied, his voice firm and resonant. "Go tell your master, Elijah is here." Obadiah slowly stood up, a cold dread stealing his breath. His eyes wide with anguish revealed his deep fear. "What have I done," he pleaded, his voice cracking, "that you would put my life in danger? If I go and tell Ahab you're here, and then the Spirit of the Lord takes you somewhere else and he can't find you, he'll kill me." Then in a hushed, desperate confession, Obadiah leaned closer and revealed his secret to Elijah. "I've served the Lord faithfully since my youth. When Jezebel went around killing the prophets, I hid 100 of them in caves and fed them myself. I've done everything I could, Elijah, and now you ask this of me?" But Elijah stood firm, his resolve unshakable. He replied, his voice ringing with divine authority. "As surely as the Lord of hosts lives, whom I serve, I will stand before Ahab today." Obadiah, witnessing the prophet's unyielding conviction, knew he stood before a man who spoke as though heaven itself backed his words. And he obeyed. With his heart racing, a tumultuous drumbeat against his ribs, he returned to the palace and spoke the words nobody expected to hear. "Elijah has returned." The prophet who had sealed the heavens shut, who had humbled the king before his very throne and vanished as quickly as he appeared, had finally returned. Without hesitation, Ahab mounted his chariot and set out toward the appointed place, his face grim, his mind a whirlwind of anger and apprehension. The merciless sun blazed down over the dry, barren fields, its heat shimmering in the desolate air. The moment the two men, King Ahab and the prophet Elijah, finally met was charged with an almost palpable tension. It was Ahab who broke the heavy silence, his voice laced with disdain and a lingering resentment. "Is that you, troublemaker of Israel?" he sneered, his eyes narrowed in accusation. But Elijah met his gaze, his own eyes burning with righteous indignation, and replied firmly, "I'm not the one troubling Israel, but rather you and your father's house, because you have abandoned the commands of the Lord and have chosen to follow Baal." The truth, stark and undeniable, hung in the sweltering air between them. Then, with a boldness that defied the very power of the king, Elijah issued an audacious challenge, a direct confrontation that would expose the true God. "Now summon all Israel to Mount Carmel. Bring along the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asher who dine at Jezebel's table. Today we will see who truly is God." Ahab, perhaps intrigued by the sheer audacity of the challenge, or perhaps sensing the eyes of his desperate people upon him, surprisingly agreed to the test. And so the ultimate showdown began. News of the impending confrontation spread like wildfire throughout all Israel, carried on the dry winds. Thousands upon thousands from every corner of the parched kingdom began their arduous ascent toward Mount Carmel. Elders and youths, priests and soldiers, wary farmers and hardened shepherds, no one wanted to miss what was about to unfold on that sacred mountain.
At the summit of Mount Carmel, a palpable tension filled the air, thick and suffocating. On one side stood nearly 1,000 prophets of Baal and Asher, their figures arrayed in flashy, ostentatious robes adorned with a dazzling array of pagan symbols, their faces a mixture of arrogance and apprehension. On the other side stood Elijah, utterly alone, his solitary figure wrapped in a simple worn cloak, thin from exposure to the unrelenting sun and wind. The prophet, his heart heavy with sorrow for his misguided people, raised his voice, his words carrying across the hushed crowd. "How long will you waver between two opinions?" he sorrowfully asked the people. "If the Lord is God, follow him, but if it's Baal, then follow him." The crowd fell silent, their collective shame palpable, as if a heavy weight had sealed their very lips. Then Elijah stepped forward, his voice ringing with authority as he declared the rules of the challenge. "I am the only prophet of the Lord left, but Baal has 450 prophets. Bring 2 bulls. They will choose one bull, cut it into pieces, and set it on the wood, but without lighting any fire. I will prepare the other bull, place it on the wood, and also not set fire to it. Then you call upon the name of your God, and I will call upon the name of the Lord. The God who answers by fire, he is the true God." A simple, yet profound test. The prophets of Baal went first. With much fanfare and elaborate ritual, they prepared their altar, cut up their chosen bull, and laid it upon the dry wood. Then began a gruesome spectacle, a desperate, frantic display. From morning until noon, the 450 prophets screamed, leaped, and danced wildly around their altar, their voices hoarse as they called out to Baal. But there was no reply, not even the slightest sign, no flicker of acknowledgement. Baal remained utterly, embarrassingly silent, his stone visage unmoving. The sun climbed to its highest point, its rays beating down relentlessly on the fervent yet futile proceedings. Elijah, observing the tragic scene unfold, began to mock them sarcastically. "Shout louder," he taunted, his voice carrying clearly. "Maybe Baal is busy, or he's wandered off somewhere. Perhaps he's sleeping and you need to wake him up." In wild, escalating desperation, they screamed even louder, intensifying their grim performance by cutting themselves with knives and lances, until their own blood flowed freely, mingling with the dust of the altar. Afternoon drifted slowly across Mount Carmel, the shadows lengthening, yet still no answer came. No fire descended from the heavens. The crowd, their initial anticipation replaced by a growing disillusionment, began to whisper, their murmurs growing louder. Baal's utter powerlessness was laid bare before the eyes of all Israel. Now it was Elijah's turn. Weary and disappointed, the people gathered close around him, their silence heavy with unspoken questions. Silently, deliberately, Elijah took 12 stones, one for each tribe of Israel, a symbolic act of unity and remembrance, and meticulously rebuilt the broken altar of the Lord, a structure that had been desecrated and neglected. Carefully, reverently, he arranged the wood and placed the sacrifice upon it. Then he asked for the impossible, a demand that seemed ludicrous in the midst of the devastating drought. He commanded them to bring 4 large jars full of precious water and pour it over the sacrifice. They did it once, then twice, and finally a third time, until the altar was thoroughly soaked, water filling the trench surrounding it. It was a defiant act of faith, making any human trickery impossible. Then standing before all the people, the prophet lifted his eyes toward the heavens, his face illuminated by an unwavering conviction, and cried out, his voice ringing with a profound, unshakable faith. "Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let them know today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and that all I have done has been at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people may know you alone are God, and that you are drawing their hearts back to you." A brief yet profound silence followed his fervent prayer. The air crackled with anticipation. Suddenly, in a blinding flash, fire blazed from heaven, a scorching, living flame, fierce and all-consuming, that devoured the sacrifice instantly along with the wood, the very stones of the altar, and even the water itself, leaving behind only dust and a profound, reverent silence. It was a clear, undeniable demonstration of divine power. Falling to their knees, awestruck and utterly overwhelmed, the people as one acknowledged the true God, crying out in unison, their voices filled with a mixture of terror and awe. "The Lord, He is God! The Lord, He is God!" At that very moment there was no doubt left. Yahweh had answered. Not Baal, not any of the pagan deities. Elijah's spiritual authority was unmistakably proven, and the crowd finally understood with chilling clarity that the devastating drought had come as a direct, undeniable consequence of abandoning the one true God. The truth shone brighter than ever atop Mount Carmel. The prophet then turned his gaze toward Baal's false prophets, those who had reveled in their arrogance, which now lay in ashes, reduced to nothingness. He commanded that they be seized. They were taken down to the Kishon Brook, a place that would forever bear witness to divine justice, where the judgment once ordained by God in ancient times was carried out, the swift execution of all those who had relentlessly led Israel astray into the depths of idolatry. The land of Israel, at long last, had begun to be purified, cleansed of the spiritual filth that had choked its very soul.
As the people watched this decisive, cathartic moment unfold by the Kishon Brook, Elijah, amidst the scene of divine justice, suddenly felt something stir within his spirit, a sensation he hadn't experienced in 3 long, desolate years. It was the faint, distant whisper of coming rain, a sound no one else could yet discern, lost in the lingering dust and the quiet awe. But it was a sound the prophet, attuned to the voice of God, knew would soon become undeniably obvious to everyone. The air itself seemed to hum with this nascent promise. The prophet then turned, his gaze fixed on King Ahab, and addressed him with renewed authority, his voice ringing with a conviction that brooks no argument. "Prepare your chariot and head down immediately, for I hear the roar of an approaching storm." Ahab, skeptical yet undeniably shaken by the day's events,
raised his eyes to a sky that remained as dry and clear as it had been for the past 3 years. Yet he obeyed nonetheless, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of a glimmer of dawning understanding. The drought had served its purpose, its prolonged agony a stark lesson, and now God stood ready, poised to open the heavens once again and pour out his boundless mercy upon the parched land. Then Elijah climbed once more to the mountain's peak, a solitary figure against the vast sky, and began to pray fervently, his whole being poured into his petitions. He was determined, his faith the unshakable conviction of someone who truly knows the God he serves. Beside him stood his servant, a young man, faithfully awaiting instructions, his face reflecting the wonder and exhaustion of the day. "Go up and look toward the sea," Elijah ordered. The young man, without question, ran, looked, returned, and answered breathlessly, "There's nothing there." Elijah remained still, his focus unwavering, and with firm conviction insisted, "Go back and look again." The servant went a second time, his movements quick, and saw nothing. He went a third time, a fourth, a fifth, and even a sixth time, each return bringing the same disheartening news. "I see nothing, sir." Yet Elijah refused to quit. He continued pouring out his heart in prayer, his spirit knowing deep down that God was not finished yet. His persistence was a testament to his unwavering trust. The seventh time, the young servant ran back excitedly, his eyes wide with wonder, exclaiming, "Now I see a small cloud rising from the sea, no larger than the palm of a hand." For Elijah, that was more than enough. It was the undeniable sign he had waited for, the promise being fulfilled. He quickly stood up, urgency in his voice, and commanded with swiftness, "Go tell Ahab to hitch up his chariot and hurry down before the rain stops him." In just a few short minutes, that small palm-sized cloud grew larger, swelling rapidly, consuming the vast expanse of the sky. The sky quickly turned dark, a dramatic shift from the bright, dry blue. From the horizon came a powerful, roaring wind, whipping up dust and debris. The people, their faces upturned, lifted their eyes in awe. After 3 long, agonizing years, heavy drops began to fall upon the dry, thirsty land. Within moments, the gentle drizzle transformed into a torrential downpour, a raging torrent that soaked the parched earth and formed new gushing streams rushing through the cracked and barren ground. It was a deluge, a cleansing, a miraculous outpouring of divine mercy. Ahab, startled by the sudden downpour, quickly climbed onto his chariot and started down towards Jezreel, his horses straining, driven onward by the heavy rain now saturating everything around him. But then something truly extraordinary happened. The hand of the Lord, a divine power, came mightily upon Elijah. The prophet, with a burst of supernatural energy, tucked his cloak into his belt and began to run. Not as an ordinary man would run, but with an incredible, superhuman speed, propelled forward by the very power of God. Before the king's astonished eyes, the prophet outran the horses, running through the pounding storm as if carried by the rushing wind itself. It was an image of incredible power, a stark, undeniable display of who truly held dominion over Israel. The man who closed the heavens now ran ahead of the king, clearly demonstrating who truly ruled, not Ahab, nor Jezebel, nor the impotent Baal, but Yahweh, the living God who commands the rains and the seasons, the very rhythms of life. Yet this rainfall was more than mere water, more than a simple cessation of drought. It was a profound, life-altering lesson. God answers those who pray persistently, those who cling to faith even when the evidence is scarce. He did not respond at Elijah's first desperate attempt, nor his second, nor even his sixth. God answered only after Elijah continued to pray faithfully, his spirit unwavering, trusting fully in the promise he had received. The drought had finally ended, and the people, their hearts overflowing with relief, experienced the mercy they had long awaited. But the battle was just beginning. Even as the abundant rain poured down upon Israel, cleansing the land, an enraged woman, her heart consumed with fury, brooded inside the palace. Jezebel, seething with a vengeful fire, was preparing. Elijah was about to face the greatest test of his life, a challenge that would push him to the very limits of his faith and endurance.
In the palace at Jezreel, Jezebel received the news, a messenger recounting the prophet's triumph, the utter humiliation of her prophets, the destruction of her priests, and now, the terrifying realization, the people themselves were beginning to turn against her. her face twisted into a grotesque expression of pure fury, a mask of unbridled rage. She sent a messenger to the prophet, bearing a threat that was far more than a mere warning. It was a chilling, absolute promise of death. May the gods punish me severely if by this time tomorrow I don't do to you exactly what you did to each of them. When Elijah heard these words, an icy, consuming fear gripped his heart, darker and deeper than any he had ever known. The very prophet who had so bravely stood before hundreds on Mount Carmel and fearlessly called down fire from heaven, now trembled before one woman's wrath. Without thinking, without pausing to seek God's counsel, without waiting for divine instruction, he fled. He ran southward, abandoning the very people who had just begun to return to God, leaving behind his appointed mission, his divine purpose. Blinded completely by the suffocating grip of fear, he passed through fields and mountains, never stopping, never looking back, driven by an unseen terror, like a man pursued by death itself. At last, utterly exhausted, both physically and spiritually, he reached the desolate wilderness, a place of stark emptiness. There, under the thin, inadequate shade of a broom tree, the prophet collapsed to the ground. With tears he could no longer hold back, tears of profound anguish and despair, he cried out bitterly toward heaven, "Enough, Lord, take my life now, for I am no better than my ancestors." Those words, raw and agonizing, burst forth from the deepest, most wounded part of his soul. Elijah, the great prophet, had reached rock bottom. All his strength, his unshakable faith, and his immense courage seemed to have evaporated under the ruthless, unforgiving heat of the desert sun. And there, beneath the sparse, mocking shade of the tree, he wished only to close his eyes forever, find eternal oblivion. It wasn't merely Jezebel's direct, terrifying threat that had broken him, but also the unbearable, soul-crushing loneliness, the heavy burden of feeling he alone was faithful, and the deep, bitter disappointment that after all his monumental struggles, nothing truly appeared to have changed. The fight seemed endless, and he felt utterly, hopelessly alone. Yet there, deep in the desolate embrace of the desert, in the darkest, most profound moment of his life, God did not abandon him. As Elijah lay broken and despairing, a profound mercy unfolded. Suddenly, a gentle hand, soft yet firm, touched him. Elijah slowly opened his weary eyes, heavy with unshed tears and the weight of his despair, and saw beside him an angel. The angelic being spoke with a tenderness that soothed his tormented soul, yet with a firmness that conveyed divine purpose. "Get up and eat." Elijah, his senses dulled, looked around and miraculously saw freshly baked bread, its aroma comforting, cooking over hot coals, and a jar of fresh, cool water. He ate and drank, but the crushing weight upon his heart still felt too heavy, too insurmountable. Exhausted by his emotional turmoil, he again drifted into sleep, hoping to escape his pain, even if just for a little while. But the angel returned once more, patiently and compassionately. He touched Elijah again, his touch a silent balm to the prophet's weary spirit, and spoke again in a calm but firm voice, "Get up and eat, for you still have a long journey ahead." These words, infused with divine will, echoed deeply within Elijah's weary heart. The prophet who had fled in despair, who had wished for death, now found himself moving, not towards oblivion, but towards an even closer, deeper encounter with God. He was to journey to Mount Horeb, the sacred mountain, the very spot where, centuries earlier, God had spoken face to face with Moses. Here, in this holy place, Elijah would discover something entirely new about himself and about God's nature. For Elijah was human, deeply, profoundly human, vulnerable and flawed. Although God had used him to accomplish incredible miracles, had wrought impossible wonders through his hands, now he faced a reality far tougher to confront: his own inherent frailty, his raw, undeniable humanity. Yet in that broken human condition, God was merciful to him, demonstrating a divine understanding. For even the people of God grow tired, they too suffer, and they too doubt, their faith faltering under immense pressure. Under that broom tree, Elijah came to a profound understanding. God doesn't only use people who are strong, those who seem invincible. Instead, he lifts up those who are broken, those who feel utterly shattered. For in our deepest weakness, God's greatest works often begin. That miraculous meal, given by angelic hands, imbued Elijah with an unexplainable, supernatural strength. He stood up, his body replenished, his spirit rekindled, and began his long, arduous journey toward Horeb. Empowered by that divine nourishment, he traveled for 40 days and 40 nights, enduring the scorching desert, relentlessly pressing onward until he reached Mount Horeb, the sacred mountain of God, where he would once again speak with his Creator face to face. Elijah arrived at Mount Horeb, the ancient sacred mountain, where, centuries earlier, God had given Moses the stone tablets of the law. Now exhausted and broken by his recent ordeal, Elijah entered a dark cave, seeking shelter from the harsh, biting wind that swept across the mountain. And there, in the deep solitude and echoing silence of that cave, God spoke directly to him, his voice penetrating the prophet's very soul. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" With a face still hidden by anguish, the prophet answered from the depths of his wounded heart, his voice raw with pain and a sense of profound injustice. "I have been deeply zealous for you, Lord God Almighty, but the Israelites have abandoned your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I am the only one left alive, and now they want to kill me as well." Elijah's voice sounded fragile and weary, like that of a man who had struggled alone for too long, bearing an immense burden without shared solace. But God, in his infinite wisdom, answered without reproach, without a single word of scolding or condemnation. Instead, he simply invited Elijah to step out of the cave and stand upon the mountain, for the Lord himself was about to pass by. Suddenly, a fierce, destructive wind arose, so powerful that it tore the very rocks apart, splitting them with immense force, and shook the entire mountain to its foundations. Elijah clung tightly to the stone walls of the cave entrance, his eyes wide. But the Lord was not in that violent, terrifying wind. Then came an earthquake, a deep, rumbling tremor that shook the ground beneath his feet, causing the earth to heave and crack. But the Lord was not in the earthquake either. After the earthquake, a blazing fire appeared, lighting up the mountain with an intense, burning ferocity, consuming everything in its path. But the Lord was not in the fire either.
And then, after the immense displays of raw power, a profound calm arrived. An absolute, pervasive silence wrapped around the mountain, a stillness that was deeper than any Elijah had ever experienced. And out of that profound silence came something entirely different, a gentle whisper, barely audible, like a soft breeze gently brushing against the skin. It was a sound so subtle, yet so utterly potent. Hearing that quiet whisper, that almost imperceptible breath, Elijah knew, with an unshakable certainty, that God was there. He immediately covered his face with his cloak, a gesture of reverence and awe, stepped slowly out of the cave, and stood at the entrance, bathed in the presence of the Almighty. In that gentle whisper was the same powerful voice that had created the entire universe, but now it spoke with the tenderness of a loving father comforting his weary child. With infinite patience, God asked again, his voice soft yet resonant, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" The prophet, still burdened by his perceived isolation, repeated his complaint once more, pouring out his heart. Yet this time, in the heavenly whisper, something profound inside him began to heal, a deep wound beginning to close. God did not accuse him, nor did he reject him. Instead, he gave him a new purpose, a renewed sense of mission, speaking clearly with undeniable authority. "Go back the way you came. You will anoint Hazael king over Syria, Jehu king over Israel, and Elisha to replace you as prophet." Then he revealed something even deeper, something that Elijah, in his despair, had never known, a truth that shattered his sense of lonely isolation. "I have reserved 7,000 in Israel, 7,000 who have not bowed their knees to Baal or kissed his idols." As he listened to these words, the prophet's heart, which had been so heavy, began to beat strongly again, filled with a surge of renewed hope and purpose. He was not alone. He had never been alone. God had preserved a faithful remnant, hidden and protected, waiting for just the right moment to come forward. Their ministry, their purpose, had not been in vain. Elijah came down from Mount Horeb with a renewed heart and a clear, unwavering purpose. He was no longer the same man who had once asked for death beneath the broom tree, utterly broken and despondent. Now he walked with steady, confident steps, understanding with a profound certainty that his story was not finished, and that, crucially, he would not finish it alone. God had given him clear directions, specific individuals to anoint to prepare for future roles in his grand design. Among those names, one stood out with special purpose: Elisha, son of Shaphat. And so Elijah went to the fields where Elisha worked with his own hands, a farmer, not a priest or prophet, a man of the earth. Elisha was plowing the ground with 12 yoke of oxen, guiding the 12th himself, his movements skilled and practiced. His hands were toughened by relentless labor, his cloak covered in the dust of the fields, his back bent from daily toil. But God had noticed him, had set his divine gaze upon this ordinary man. Elijah approached him silently, removed his own distinctive cloak, and placed it onto Elisha's shoulders. This simple, yet incredibly profound gesture spoke volumes. It was the unmistakable sign of a divine calling, the sacred passing of a holy purpose, and the powerful beginning of a new destiny. Elisha stopped, his hands still on the plow. He felt the weight of the cloak resting upon his shoulders, a tangible sign of the immense responsibility now placed upon him, and instantly realized what it meant. In that singular moment, he knew with an unshakable certainty that his life had changed forever. He ran after Elijah, asking for one final act of compassion, one last embrace of his old life. "Let me kiss my father and mother goodbye, and then I will follow you." Elijah replied without emotion or pressure, his voice calm yet knowing. "Go back then. Don't you realize what I've just done to you?" Then something truly radical happened. Elisha returned to the fields, but not to stay. He took the yoke of oxen he'd been working with, animals that represented his former livelihood, and slaughtered them. Then he took the plow, the wood, and the very tools of his trade and set them ablaze upon a makeshift altar, a symbolic burning of his past. Upon this sacrificial pyre, he cooked the meat and shared it with the people in his village, a final communal meal, a definitive farewell. He burned his past. He left absolutely nothing to return to, no excuses, no safety net. He left everything behind and followed Elijah. And from that day forward, Elisha became his devoted servant, walking in the footsteps of the fiery prophet.
Years had passed since the awe-inspiring fire of God had descended upon Mount Carmel, a searing testament to divine power. Yet with the relentless march of time, the people of Israel seemed to have slowly, tragically forgotten the powerful warning, the profound lesson learned that day. Israel, with a disheartening predictability, returned to its old familiar routines of idolatry and spiritual apathy. King Ahab, despite having witnessed the undeniable, overwhelming power of God firsthand, continued to rule as if nothing had fundamentally changed, his heart stubbornly resistant to true transformation. He remained a weak king, easily swayed and completely controlled by his ruthless, manipulative wife, Jezebel. In Samaria, Ahab had everything a king could possibly wish for: opulent palaces, sprawling gardens, glittering gold, and a legion of subservient servants. Yet, deep inside his covetous heart, he still yearned for something more, something that lay just beyond his grasp, something he was determined to possess. Next to his sprawling palace lived a righteous man named Naboth. His vineyard, though not grand or luxurious by royal standards, held a significance far greater than its physical dimensions. It was the sacred inheritance of his ancestors, a land passed down through generations, imbued with deep familial and spiritual meaning. Ahab's greedy heart desired it from the very first moment he saw it, a festering covetousness taking root. Approaching Naboth with a false, ingratiating smile, he offered money or even a better, more sprawling vineyard in exchange. But Naboth, a man of unwavering principle, refused firmly, his words echoing ancient law. "The Lord forbid that I should give you the inheritance of my ancestors." Ahab returned to his palace like a spoiled, petulant child, consumed by his unfulfilled desire. He lay down on his bed, turned his face toward the wall, and childishly refused to eat. His festering greed had deeply wounded his pride, and his inherent weakness filled him with a bitter, simmering resentment. When Jezebel, ever shrewd and manipulative, saw his misery, she scornfully asked, her voice dripping with disdain, "Are you or are you not the king of Israel? Get up, eat, and cheer up. I will get Naboth's vineyard for you." And with chilling, calculating cruelty, she did just that.
She wrote letters in the king's name, forging his authority, and sealed them with his royal seal, lending them an undeniable legitimacy. She then cunningly proclaimed a fast, a public show of piety, and had Naboth seated in a place of honor among the people. But next to him, two wicked, unscrupulous men took their seats. And before the entire gathering, with brazen lies, they falsely accused Naboth, their voices ringing with manufactured righteousness. Naboth has cursed God and the king. Without the semblance of a fair trial, or the opportunity for a defense, Naboth was brutally dragged outside the city walls and stoned to death. His only crime? Standing up for what rightfully belonged to him, refusing to yield his inheritance to the king's insatiable greed. When the news of Naboth's murder reached Jezebel, a cruel smile of satisfaction spread across her lips. She quickly told Ahab, her voice devoid of remorse, "Get up and seize the vineyard. Naboth is no longer alive." Ahab, his heart gladdened by his ill-gotten gain, went to admire his new land, pleased like a spoiled child, truly believing he had won. But as he wandered through the vineyard, admiring his new possession, Elijah suddenly appeared, his face hardened with the unyielding judgment of God. The king, startled and trembling at his unexpected sight, asked, his voice laced with fear, "So, you have found me, my enemy?" Elijah replied without hesitation, his voice ringing with divine condemnation, "Yes, I have found you, because you have sold yourself to do evil in the sight of the Lord." And once again, with the same powerful authority that had commanded the heavens, Elijah delivered a crushing judgment, proclaiming the very words of God. "Thus says the Lord, in the same place where dogs licked up Naboth's blood, they will also lick up yours, yes, yours. I will bring disaster upon you, wiping out your descendants and destroying your lineage, just as I did with Jeroboam. As for Jezebel your wife, dogs will devour her body beside the wall of Jezreel. Anyone from your household who dies in the city will be eaten by dogs, and those who die in the open fields will be consumed by the birds of the air." Ahab's face grew pale, bleached of color. For the first time, Elijah's voice seemed to him not that of a mere enemy, but of an unyielding judge, a messenger of inevitable divine retribution. And this time Ahab did not shout or curse, nor did he call for his soldiers to seize the prophet. Instead, he tore his garments, a traditional sign of deep distress, put on sackcloth, a symbol of mourning and repentance, and began fasting, his spirit heavy with dread. He lay down silently, refusing to eat, his arrogance replaced by a profound, if temporary, humility. He walked slowly, his face bowed down, tears of remorse or perhaps fear streaming down his face. From heaven, God saw this unexpected display of humility and spoke to Elijah once again, his voice revealing a divine reprieve. "Because Ahab has humbled himself before me, I will not bring disaster during his lifetime, but rather in the days of his son, I will bring calamity upon his household." Ahab was warned, unequivocally. He would pay a heavy, devastating price for the idolatry and pervasive corruption he had sown throughout all Israel. Years passed, and Ahab, perhaps lulled into a false sense of security by the passing of time, thought perhaps God had forgotten his judgment, or perhaps his wrath had simply dissipated. He was sorely mistaken. He decided to wage war, to reclaim the strategically important city of Ramoth-Gilead from Syrian control, a desperate attempt to shore up his waning power and restore his kingdom's prestige. Even though a prophet of the Lord warned him with chilling clarity that he would surely die in this campaign, Ahab stubbornly ignored God's voice, convinced of his own invincibility. He disguised himself, believing he could outsmart destiny, could cheat the very hand of fate. But an arrow, seemingly shot at random, pierced through his armor, striking exactly at its weakest point. As the battle raged on, a chaotic symphony of steel and screams, Ahab lay quietly bleeding inside his chariot until he finally died at sunset, his life draining away with the fading light. And when they washed his chariot, dogs licked up his blood, just as Elijah had prophesied, a grim fulfillment of divine judgment. Thus died Ahab, arguably the worst king Israel had ever known, his reign ending in a pool of his own blood. And his son Ahaziah, a young man already corrupted by the legacy of his parents, took his place on the throne.
It wasn't long before Ahaziah, true to his upbringing, followed the same corrupt path his parents had paved, embracing idolatry and forsaking the true God. One fateful day, Ahaziah fell through a latticework from an upper window of his palace in Samaria, a careless accident with grave consequences. Seriously injured and confined to his bed, the young king made a decision that would ultimately seal his fate. Rather than calling upon the God of Israel, the true source of healing and help, he sent messengers to Ekron, a Philistine city, to consult Baal-zebub, the pagan god of flies and disease, a deity of pestilence and death. But God, omniscient and ever-watchful, had seen this act of profound apostasy. He immediately instructed Elijah, "Arise and intercept the king of Samaria's messengers, and say to them, 'Is there no God in Israel that you must go consult Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron? Therefore the Lord says this, you will not leave the bed you lie on, but will surely die.'" Elijah obeyed without hesitation, and the message, a stark pronouncement of death, quickly reached the palace, shattering the king's fragile hopes. Surprised, Ahaziah asked his messengers, his voice tinged with a desperate curiosity, "What kind of man was it who came to meet you?" They answered, describing the prophet's distinctive appearance, "He was a man wearing a garment of hair with a leather belt around his waist," and Ahaziah knew immediately. It was Elijah the Tishbite. The king's anger blazed, a furious, impotent rage. He sent a captain with 50 soldiers to arrest the prophet, to seize the messenger of his doom. They found Elijah sitting calmly atop a hill, a serene figure amidst the brewing storm. The captain, puffed up with arrogance, shouted loudly, "Man of God, the king commands you to come down." But Elijah replied quietly, his voice resonating with divine power, "If I truly am a man of God, let fire come down from heaven and consume you and your 50 men." And then it happened. A roar tore through the heavens, a terrifying sound. Flames fell, a scorching torrent of divine wrath, and consumed the captain and his 50 soldiers in an instant, their cries fading to nothing, reduced to ashes. Ahaziah, stubborn in his rebellion, still unrepentant, sent another captain with another 50 men. The result was precisely the same: fire, judgment, death. Yet the third captain was different. He came without orders or threats, his heart humbled by the preceding tragedies. He fell to his knees before Elijah, lifted his hands in supplication, and pleaded, his voice filled with genuine humility, "Man of God, I beg you, please let my life and the lives of these 50 servants of yours be precious in your sight." And this time, the voice of God spoke to Elijah, not with fire, but with gentle guidance. "Go down with him. Do not be afraid." The prophet arose and went down with the third captain to the palace. With a quiet yet undeniable authority, he stood before Ahaziah's bedside, his presence a living testament to God's power, reaffirming what had already been declared. "Thus says the Lord, because you sent messengers to consult Baal-zebub, as if there were no God in Israel, you shall not rise from the bed you lie on, you shall surely die." And so it was. Ahaziah died, just as the word of the Lord had spoken through the mouth of his prophet. With him fell yet another link in the corrupt line of Ahab, under the full, inescapable weight of divine judgment. Ahaziah's death marked the definitive end of a generation, a final grim chapter in the house of Ahab's wicked rule. He left no son to occupy his throne, and the house of Ahab, once so powerful, began to crumble like a wall cracked from within, its foundations rotting from years of idolatry and injustice. Yet even as judgment unfolded inside the palace walls, something sacred stirred along the dusty roads of Israel, a different kind of ending, a new beginning. For now, Elijah himself was preparing to depart, not toward death, the common fate of all mortals, but toward eternity, a fiery ascension. Elijah knew the end had come for his earthly ministry. His spirit, finely attuned by years of listening closely to God's unmistakable voice, sensed it with absolute clarity, an inner knowing that transcended doubt. His time on earth was finished, but his farewell would not happen in silence, nor would he face it alone. From Gilgal, a place steeped in the history of Israel's miraculous beginnings, the prophet began his final, momentous journey. Elijah arose early that morning, the desert breeze feeling gentler than usual, and the sun had not yet fully risen, but already Elijah had set out on his path. Beside him walked Elisha, his devoted student, his chosen successor, the young man who had left absolutely everything behind just to follow him, and who, from that day onward, had not spent even a single day away from his side, a faithful shadow. At every stop along their final journey, Elijah was testing Elisha's heart, probing the depth of his commitment. When they reached the entrance to the Promised Land, a place of historical significance, Elijah said to him, his voice laced with a subtle challenge, "Stay here, Elisha, because the Lord has sent me on to Bethel." But Elisha, his loyalty unwavering, didn't hesitate. He declared with resolute conviction, "As surely as the Lord lives, and as surely as you yourself live, I will never leave you."
And so they continued walking together, their footsteps echoing a shared destiny. At Bethel, a group of prophets came out to meet them, their faces grim, their knowledge of the impending event palpable. They pulled Elisha aside and quietly asked him, their voices hushed with solemn understanding, "Do you know the Lord is going to take your master away from you today?" Elisha simply nodded, his own heart heavy. "Yes, I know. Be silent." They journeyed on, their path leading them deeper into the historical landscape, and once again, Elijah said to him, "Stay here." His voice carried the same subtle test, "Because the Lord now sends me to Jericho." But Elisha's answer didn't change, his resolute, unbreakable. He stubbornly refused to leave his master's side, his commitment absolute. So they came to Jericho, the ancient city known for miracles of old, for its miraculously fallen walls, a place of both past triumph and divine intervention. Here again the group of prophets approached Elisha and repeated their solemn warning, their voices filled with a shared sense of impending loss. But Elisha, in sorrowful silence, replied once more, "Yes, I know. Be silent."